Good evening. My name is Richard Drake, and I teach in the history department here. I want to inform you that following our lecture tonight, if you have questions, please come up to the microphone and speak into the microphones. We have two of them set up here, and try to make your questions and to be as direct and succinct as you can be for our speaker. Also, following the question and answer period, we will have a book signing. Professor Bilmes will be signing her books just outside the door here once the Q&A is over. Tonight, we have President George M. Dennison introducing Professor Bilmes. I'm here to introduce him. And it's fitting that he should be the one to undertake this introduction. This is, after all, the President's Lecture Series. And so I'm delighted that we have the President himself here tonight to do these honors. I would like to add one other comment about President Dennison. Without his unstinting support of the President's Lecture Series over these last many years now, our series would have gone out of existence. And so I'm extremely beholden to him for his ardent and highly reliable support of the series over these years. So please join me in welcoming President Dennison to the lectern.
Thanks very much, Richard, and thank all of you for being here. Before I do the introduction, I'd like to ask all of you to join me in recognizing Professor Richard Drake for 23 years of coordinating the President's Lecture Series. Let's give him a round of applause. This evening, with the support and the involvement of the Kimmitt family, we celebrate the work and accomplishments of Stan Kimmitt. Many of us knew Stan, maybe many of you did. He was a Montanan who spent his life in public service. His lifetime commitment to that role, the public interest, is certainly worthy of our celebrating his life through this annual lecture and internship in Washington, D.C. for a University of Montana student. So every year we have a lecture, and we identify a student who can spend time in D.C. working with one member of the Montana delegation and getting wonderful experience. We happen to have that student here with us this evening. Would you stand, Austin? In a long and distinguished career, Stan embodied the ideals of public service and government. Many of you know that he was Mike Mansfield's able ally, served for a number of years as the Secretary of the House. I think he probably took more pride in his work to establish the Vietnam Memorial than any other action in Congress. An open and free society depends on the willingness of citizens to work actively in a variety of capacities, and Stan was certainly a good model of that. Tonight's speaker, Professor Linda Bilmes, comes, I think, most appropriately this evening because she knows at least one member of the family. As I recall, Mark, you were in college with?
And I know Bob.
Yes.
Yeah.
And is familiar with the Kemet tradition. In addition to that, she has recently published the book, The People Factor, Strengthening America by Investing in Public Service. In this book, she and her co-author, Deputy Secretary of Veteran Affairs, William Scott Gould, argue that America cannot prosper without a strong, highly functional federal workforce. And they call for the country to invest in its civil service so that it may better serve the nation. For her discussion of public service this evening, Professor Bilmes draws upon a very rich professional background. After receiving a BA in government and the MBA from Harvard University, she spent 10 years as a management consultant. And this evening at dinner, she was arguing that really there's much in common between the person who works in that capacity in the private sector and a member of the public service, and that we ought to be more aware of that. Subsequently, after 10 years in that role, she returned to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard to teach courses on budgeting and public finance. And she also directs the Kennedy School's program that assists cities and towns to maintain financial stability, certainly a topic of great interest in today's world, and involves students in that work. We had a pretty good discussion of that this evening, and perhaps she will have more to say on it. A leading expert on U.S. budgeting and public finance, she's held a number of senior positions in government, including Assistant Secretary and Chief Financial Officer of the U.S. Department of Commerce, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Administration, and the U.S. representative to several high-ranking commissions, including a Treasury Department commission to examine the viability of the Inter-American Investment Corporation. She currently serves now on the National Parks Second Century Commission and has visited Montana on a number of occasions, most recently Yellowstone Park, to check on the wolves, as I understand it. Best known, however, to the public for the national and international bestseller that she co-wrote with Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz of Columbia University, and the book will be here, as well as the other, for you to have a signing on, The $3 Trillion War, the True Cost of the Iraq Conflict. She writes extensively on financial and budgetary issues in national newspapers, magazines, and scholarly journals. She's frequently testified in Congress and also appears on national television, radio, and news programs on related topics. Please join me in thanking and welcoming to Montana, Missoula, the campus of the University of Montana, and the podium, Professor Linda Bilmes.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And actually, can you hear me okay? I don't need that microphone. Everyone hear me fine with this one? Thank you very much for inviting me here, and thank you very much for coming out in the snow to hear about a topic that I can probably tell you why there is no movement in Washington on this topic just by how many people are here tonight. The problems of the federal government and the federal workforce are they're very, very important, but they're not sexy problems, and it's very hard to get our Congress and our government to really focus on investing in and reinvigorating the civil service. But I'm going to try and pique your interest in this topic tonight. And so I will start off by telling you just a little bit about how we came to write this book called The People Factor about the federal workforce. And as the President said, I had come from the private sector before I went into the Commerce Department serving as Assistant Secretary, and so all of a sudden I was in charge of several thousand, 40,000 employees in the government, as well as 860,000 additional employees working for the census. And I had been studying previously, and I had written a book on how great companies manage their workforces. I came in and worked with Scott Gould, who was a Navy captain, had commanded a carrier, and had come from a military background. And both of us, me coming from kind of researching best companies in the private sector and him coming from the military, were really stunned by how, not only how poorly we managed the civil service, but how the basic lessons that were evident and that were learned and known in the military and in best companies in the private sector had not somehow translated into the government. And it was through that and through working in the Commerce Department and seeing that that we decided that even though it was somewhat outside of our core areas for both of us, that we would write this book. Scott, my co-author, is now the Deputy Secretary of the Veterans Department, which is the second largest department in government, trying to really live and walk the talk of the people factor. And I am going around the country and preaching about it. I am going to talk to you about 4 things tonight. First of all, why we should focus on, when we think about public service, why we should start by focusing on the federal government. Secondly, I'll talk to you a little bit and show you some of the academic work in the People Factor book, which essentially shows a correlation between how we treat people and how organizations perform. Third, I will show you a couple of examples, because there are very few, of where these techniques have been used in government. And what you'll see is that they work really well in government. It's just no one uses them. And then we can talk a little bit about the implications. I'm also open to answer questions from you about anything in my general area of work, which includes the government budget, the debt, the deficits, state and local public financing and pensions, national parks, and a wide range of other topics, all of which, in a way, are related to how we manage the people who are in charge of these things. When we start off thinking about public service, it's a very large topic. And there are many definitions of public service and things that we can start with. And we started focusing really on the federal government, because when I think about public service and I look at my students at the Kennedy School and others who I teach, there are many, many different paths to public service, whether you're working in the private sector or the nonprofit sector or the voluntary sector or any other sector. But what you find is that pretty much whatever you're doing somehow goes back to the federal government. And it's hard to even get our minds around how much the federal government is in our lives. But when you wake up to the atomic time, which actually comes from the atomic clock in Boulder, Colorado. If anyone has ever been to see the atomic clock, anyone ever been to see the atomic clock? It looks like a giant ping pong table with thousands of little Scrabble tile prisms on it. And the prisms reflect the light, which goes into a cylinder and bounces up to the top and comes back, and that's the atomic time. That's where Greenwich Mean Time comes from. And the last time I was there, the 3 physicists who run the atomic clock were showing me with great pride that they had fixed the leaking roof with a tarpaulin they got on sale at REI. And this is the atomic, time. When you have breakfast, everything you eat is regulated by the Department of Agriculture. When you go to drive anywhere, everything having to do with roads, with oil prices, with emissions, with fuel, with airbags, with safety, everything is controlled by people in the federal government. Federal government controls radio waves, controls spectrum, allocates spectrum, broadband. The federal government is the only organization in the country that has weather forecasting capabilities, apart from the Air Force, which has a small weather forecasting capability. All airline flights, anything that you see having to do with weather is controlled by the National Weather Service. What the federal government does a lot of things we know about. It controls air traffic control. It obviously has a major impact on the economy, on natural resources, on oil prices, on interest rates. You get the idea. The point is that anything you try and do in any arena, any sector, the federal government is there. And the question that we started asking was, federal government sounds kind of monolithic, but who are the people who are in charge of doing all these jobs? Who are all the men and women who are putting up the tarpaulins? You know, and where do we get them from? How do we train them? How do we measure their performance? How do we manage this giant workforce? Now, let me start out by saying that if you look at the total federal government workforce, including all of the contractors and state and local employees who are doing federal government work, and the post office and the military and grantee recipients, it's like 16 million people. But I'm talking about the tip here, which is the 1.9 million civil servants who work for the federal workforce. We tend to think of them as being kind of in Washington, but actually 85% are around the country. There's several hundred in Montana. They do an extremely wide range of jobs, anything you can think of. They are biologists, they are botanists, they are accountants, they are lawyers, they're statisticians. We have thousands of doctors working in veterans hospitals. We have 40,000 nurses working in Army hospitals who are civilian nurses, in addition to 40,000 military nurses. And when you look at the government budget, that large $3 trillion budget, more than 20% of the budget goes to labor costs, you know, people costs for the people who run government programs. So if you think about it, if 20% of the budget was anything else, we would try and look at that 20%. You know, what value were we getting out of it? What productivity were we getting out of it? But because it's people, because it's buried in the thousands of line items of all the different government programs, it doesn't really get looked at all. And most importantly, we don't really ask this question of how well is this workforce performing? And one of the things that we don't really have is a good way of thinking about how well is this workforce performing. I have a lot of material here, and I want to make sure I give you all the best stuff. I think that we are very familiar with, and certainly if you're in Montana, and you hear a lot about the poor performance of the government lately, I mean, we're very familiar with some of the major sort of failures of the federal government recently. The poor, slow responses in Hurricane Katrina, the poor intelligence of the CIA that led us into Iraq in the first place, the complete meltdown of financial regulation that led to the failures on Wall Street, the complete failure to regulate and control mortgage issuers, particularly the mortgage issuance guidance at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which has directly contributed to 15% of families in this country now being underwater on their mortgages. The meltdown at Walter Reed Army Hospital, the many, many well-known, well-publicized instances of fraud and waste and profiteering regarding Iraq war contractors. And even this Christmas, we were reminded of how much more blatant can you get than the guy whose father called the government to say that he was dangerous, and he bought a cash ticket for a one-way trip to the US, and this is a guy who was banned from landing in the UK, and we still missed it. So when you look at some of the things that are going on now, it's not hard to find major problems, structural problems in the federal government. In addition to that, which is kind of well known in the public, The government is at the same time facing really big challenges. These same 1.9 million people who are sort of in charge of all of these things are facing some of the most difficult, most complicated challenges that we have ever faced in our country. And they're more complicated than they used to be. Globalization means that anything we do with our currency, with our interest rates, with our economy, we can't really control it because it depends on what China does and what happens everywhere else. We face what I call network governance, and I've been talking to a lot of people today in Missoula about this regarding, for example, the national parks, where the national parks, if you run a park now, a national park, you're not just concerned about your park. You are working with at least a dozen different jurisdictions, with state parks, with local parks, with public-private partnerships, with conservation groups, with nonprofit organizations, with other government agencies, with a variety of jurisdictions with their own rules, their own regulations, their own bylaws, and so forth. And you have to essentially manage your environmental objectives, whether it's controlling emissions into the lake or controlling where the wolves go, with all these other jurisdictions. And everything the government does is now being done with these networks. We also have the worst financial situation, as we're all familiar with, since the Second World War, with 90%, with a debt that's 90% of GDP and growing. And finally, we face an enemy that is very, as it's been called, protean enemy. It's an enemy that reconfigures itself. So if we drive it out of Afghanistan, it's going to go into Somalia. If it leaves Somalia, it's going to go into Yemen. So all of these challenges are facing this civil service, which, as we just saw, is not performing very well. In addition, this is a federal workforce which is aging and which is about to retire. Now, some would say that's a good thing. But when you actually look at who is retiring, 50% of the federal workforce is eligible to retire now. 90% of the senior experienced people are eligible to retire. The attrition rate of new people is extremely high. For example, in the Veterans Department, where I do a lot of work, the attrition of new people coming in to be claims adjudicators is like 30% a year. Now, they are trying to get a grip on a backlog of 1 million pending veterans' disability compensation claims with a workforce of young people that is out the door before they can even get settled and learn the system. And this government needs to hire 500,000 people over the next 5 years, is having a very difficult time, even in this economy, at sort of pulling in and attracting and retaining good people. So there's something really wrong with this picture. And when you look in some specific government agencies and occupations, the situation looks worse, not better. For example, 98% of air traffic controllers are eligible to retire now. And if you think about training for air traffic control jobs, there is not enough capacity to train the people that we need, because in order to train people, they have to be in the tower during different kind of weather situations. And now, no matter how much you put somebody in a simulator, it's not the same as putting somebody with a real airplane in a real blizzard. And there just is not enough capacity to actually train the people. So you have a situation where a lot of people who work for the government could retire soon. We don't know when they will, but we know that as they are human, that in almost all cases, except for one that we know of, they are going to have to retire. So the purpose of the people factor work is really to look at how do we sort of manage this problem and how do we manage this whole resource of people to get the best performance out of them, how do we hire, recruit people, train them, how do we turn this civil service into a really high-performing organization. That leads me to the description I'm going to try and give you of the people factor, as we call it. The reason we called it the people factor was mostly because if we had called it something like federal workforce reform, there would have been even fewer people here tonight than there are now. But we call it the people factor because it, as you will see, it involves, it's not just about human resources. It's about treating our most valuable asset, which is our human capital, not as a cost, but as an asset, as strategic decision makers. And creating an environment in which these people who are in charge of all these things and have to confront all of these complicated issues can really be productive and do the best for our country. For this book, we did a lot of research. We surveyed 1,500 college students, over 2,000 public and private sector employees. We did very detailed research and field work with several hundred companies in the US and in Europe. We interviewed all the major stakeholders, you know, the unions and all the different kinds of employee groups and so forth. And we really analyzed the relationship between how organizations invest in their workforce and their long-term financial performance. We were looking at the private sector, and what's important in the private sector is how these organizations perform financially over a period of time. So not just short-term profits, but long-term sustained profits. In other words, how do the companies like GE continue to prosper and do well and thrive year after year after year after year in general, even if they have a down year here and there? What do they do? How do they develop their people? Let me tell you the key findings, and then I'll show you some of the analytics behind it. First of all, we found that organizations that invest in their workers in certain specific ways that I'll show you perform much better than their peers in terms of their long-term financial performance and in terms of how many innovations they generate. The innovation finding also correlates to job creation, which is also, of course, important for our economy. Secondly, we found that across any industry we looked at, whether it's high-tech, low-tech, retailing, any sector you can find, the companies that invested the most in their people along the criteria I'm going to show you always did better financially than the companies that did the least, sort of people management. Third, we found that the federal government, in most cases, does almost the diametric opposite of the best practice. So if you go down the whole list of how can you motivate people to get the best out of them, to generate the best productivity, you can tick off every single thing. The government does the opposite. The government not only looks like the worst companies, the government looks worse than the worst companies. And finally, one of the really interesting questions we were trying to answer was, so is government so different that, and we looked at the federal government here, but you can say the same about state government, local government, and other organizations. Is government so different that it can't respond to the same incentives? Or if you do the same best practices that we do in the military and in the best private sector companies, will government do better also? And we found that in the agencies we could find that was the case, that they did seem to respond very, very positively. The first thing I'm going to show you is what we call the people factor scorecard. And in our analysis of several hundred companies, we had to collect data on these companies about how they manage their people. And you'll see that this scorecard is divided into two sides, a human resource side on the left and what we call entrepreneurship on the right, which was the sort of developing of an entrepreneurial environment and sort of entrepreneurial motivations within the organization. And we collected data on things like how much training they provided, how they handled downsizings and layoffs, how they recognized high achievers in the organization, what their HR-type policies were, things like, did people have a development plan? Did people know how to get promoted and what they needed to do in order to get the next stage? Did they give training in order to enable people to be able to get to the next stage? And also, we collected job satisfaction indicators such as sick days and attrition rates and so forth. And from that, for each one of these companies, we had a human resources score. And on the other side, we looked at a more, somewhat more intangible but critical factor, which is this entrepreneurship, where we were looking at how work was structured, how the organization was structured. For example, did they have a lot of levels of hierarchy or few levels of hierarchy? How versatile were the employees? Did the employees, could they do a lot of different jobs? Had they worked in various parts of the organization? Did they work in teams, or were they kind of stovepiped in what they did? And this versatility issue and this teamwork issue turns out to be a really important predictor of competitiveness. I mean, this is something the private sector learned a lot from Japan when we discovered that the US auto industry was kind of going down the toilet, because in Japan in the 70s, they would put the sales guy with the engineering guy, with the design guy, with the marketing guy all together in a room, and they'd think about what kind of car made sense from a design and engineering and sales perspective. Whereas here, we had the sales guy in one building and the engineering people in another building, the manufacturing people in another building. So they never spoke to each other. And it wasn't until it got to the marketing guy or the sales guy after 3 years that they said, you know, we can't actually sell a car that looks like a pineapple. Or what, you know, and so it took the US 5 or 6 years to put a new car out, and it was taking Japan 1.5 years. I mean, so these kind of things, you know, these work structure issues turn out to be very important predictors. And we looked at entrepreneurial opportunities within the organization. What opportunities were there to do new things, to try new things, to run with your ideas? Now, what this slide shows is that the yellow circle represents the companies, of the many companies that we looked at in the different sectors, and I'll show you the US companies first and then the European companies. It shows that the companies that had the highest scores, and you can see those ones in the high box in the upper right-hand quadrant, are ones that had a high entrepreneurship score and a high HR score on the scorecard I just showed you. So they had, over a period of 7 years, an average shareholder return, an average return in the stock market of 27%. Whereas the companies, the lowest ones, and you can see in these different sectors, the highest and lowest in each cohort, in each sector, had an average shareholder return of 8%. And we saw exactly the same pattern, even more pronounced in the European companies, where the highest performing firms in terms of the high scoring human resource score and high performing entrepreneurial score had an average return of 30% versus a 10% score for the lowest companies. Now, this is a, you know, it's a observable phenomenon which is very, very pronounced. The question that, of course, one asks is a kind of chicken and egg question. Is it that the good companies are investing in their people, or is it that the companies are becoming good because they invest in their people? So we started to try and understand what was behind these numbers, to try and do some research to try and answer this chicken and egg kind of which comes first question. And I won't show you all the work, but I'll show you a couple of the things that we did, which came out of our survey of several thousand workers in these companies. And we looked at job satisfaction and loyalty to the employer as two ways to look at this. And what this shows you, the way we did this survey was that we asked the workers in the company about a whole series of different kinds of attributes, like I get a lot of training. We asked them, how important is that to you? And then how much of it do you get, and how satisfied are you? So what we find here, what that red line indicates, is that overall, the people, and this is the US one, overall 34%, so about a third of the sample, were pretty satisfied with their jobs. But among those people who said, for example, no, you probably can't read these things here, but this one says, if I have an idea that has financial benefits for my company, I can expect to receive extra compensation. For those people, almost 60% of them were satisfied. For people who said, my manager provides me with constructive criticism and advice, you can see that almost 55%, as opposed to the median of 34%, are satisfied. Among people who said, I'm able to set my own goals and priorities, 50% are satisfied as opposed to the 34%. And this is one of those things where it makes common sense. You know, I know if somebody tells me I'm doing a rotten job, that's not very motivating. But if somebody says to me, you're not doing a good job and here's why, you know, that's much, much better. And you know, basically, if I can't tell, if I'm a manager and if I can't tell Betty Lou why she's not doing her job well, then I'm not doing my job well. But in the government, no one pays any attention to that at all. I mean, it's just absolutely, you know, the concept that you need to develop people and teach them how to do better and look at mistakes is absent. We also looked at the issue of loyalty to an employer, which is kind of devotion to the mission. Here you can see displayed in a different way the same kind of thing. 46% overall of the sample very loyal to their firm, but those people, for example, who say, you know, I receive training on a regular basis, 65% of them are very loyal. I get annual performance evaluations that offer constructive criticism, 62%. My pay is linked to company's performance, 68%. So a very significant boost in both job satisfaction and loyalty from these kind of people factor type investments. Now, having said that, it's important, you know, we also looked at, you know, how many of these people receive these benefits. And you can see that, for example, 62% here say, my company makes it easy for me to put my own ideas into practice and get credit, but only 30%, you know, actually receive it, say that that's what happens to them. So twice as many think it's important as actually experience it. So in other words, what we found is that as part of explaining that issue of why is it that these companies that invest more in people do better, it's because most people don't get these benefits, but those that do, we believe, are more satisfied, more loyal to the organization. And our work suggests that these kind of attention to these kind of things, to training, to job security, to quality of HR practices, to work flexibility, to organizational structure and hierarchy, that these kind of things in our work and in the work of a lot of other academics who have done this, that these things seem to drive performance in organizations of all kinds. So the question then was, if this works so well, and I would say that a number of other people, other academics, particularly Mark Huslid and Jeffrey Pfeffer at Stanford, have found been able to isolate very specific situations like banks, where they train the bank tellers in one branch but not in another, where they treat the bank tellers a little bit differently in one than another, and identify very specific financial and performance benefits just through these kind of investments, showing at least that there is at least some, on the chicken and egg question, at least some value to improving performance through basically treating people as investments and assets as opposed to just costs. To get back to the government issue, the issue is, so if we know all this, and this is not rocket science, and this is not really that hard, and the military takes people and trains people and spends 25% of anyone's time training them, and the private sector has figured out that they do better if they do these kind of things, can this work in government? And we looked in government and found that overall, out of the many, many hundreds of government departments, although a lot of them said they were doing all kinds of wonderful things, when you actually looked at them, there were a handful, I mean literally a handful, I can count them on one hand, that were actually doing anything that even came close to the stuff that I've just been showing you. It was really stunning to show you the human resource and entrepreneurship kind of scores coming out of the government compared to the ones even in the very mediocre organizations that we were looking at in the research. But where it was being done, it worked. And here I will show you, try and go through this quickly, the Defense Logistics Agency. The Defense Logistics Agency is the part of the Defense Department. It is the organization that supplies the military with everything that it has. Defense Logistics Agency handles 25 times more stock-keeping units than Walmart. They have to have everything. I mean, they have to have every widget for every helicopter, ready meals. They need to stock everything for every piece of equipment, even if it's been obsolete for 40 years, et cetera. And what they were before they started doing the people factor stuff was a sort of typical government agency. They didn't do, you can see in 2001, they didn't do much training. The training they did was not linked to anything strategic. They, as they put it, used to give new people a pile of forms copied crooked. They didn't do anything to sort of recognize people. Their hiring of new people took 114 days. They didn't really know if anybody was satisfied, but their attrition rates were high, about 20% a year. And that was an average for the federal government. A very dynamic leader, former head of the Coast Guard, came in and took over this organization and decided to use this approach, the sort of essentially to apply a more military investing in people approach. And over the 5 years, 6 years that he was there, he instituted a very robust training program particularly for the managers, but really across the board. They outplaced people who were really poor performers, who were demotivating the organization. They created a sense of esprit de corps, ranging from giving people nice, shirts and things when they came in. I mean, just basic things to kind of increase morale among the workforce. They cut the unnecessary cost of, taking 4 months to hire people and cut that down to a best-in-government approach of 56 days. And one thing I'll come to next is how this hiring issue plays out in the student survey, how many days students can afford to wait to go and work for a job. In their job satisfaction, they started measuring it and benchmarking it not only against themselves, but against using what's called the Denison survey to benchmark against best practice in the corporate world. They started surveying people when they came in and also when they leave. You generally get the best information about an organization from people who leave. And as any of you who've worked in or taken the terrorism course here know, you know that almost everything we know about al-Qaeda, almost everything comes from the intelligence we get from defectors when they leave, who talk to US investigators. As a result of this, their human resource score doubled from 23.5 to 50. And I won't show you all of this stuff, but I'll just show you the results here. So you can see here, this is an organization that you can see from 2001 to 2006, their sales, that's the volume of stuff, if you can call it that, doubled from 17 billion to 35. At the same time, their cost as a percentage of sales went down from 25 to 14%. The number of back orders, even though sales had doubled, went down from 400,000 to 275. Their customer satisfaction among all the military units was very high. Their days to hire went down. At the same time, their cost per personnel transaction went down. They reduced the number of employees a small amount, and they used those savings to plow into the training of their supervisors. And their ranking on the government's rank from, how good is this a place to work for, which, by the way, the lowest ranking place in government now is the national parks, went from being towards the bottom of the middle to being, one of the very top. And I kind of show you this to show this is what we want our government to look like. I mean, this is the kind of productivity gain that we want with a government that works better, more efficiently, more productive, more adaptable, lower cost, et cetera. And it's right here within grasp. But it requires some upfront investment and some leadership in order to sort of carry this out. Now, a second organization that had followed this same approach is the GAO, Government Accountability Office, under David Walker. You may know, has David Walker come here with the Fiscal Wake Up Tour? Yeah, he has. David, who is a good friend of mine, I'm one of the last 3 contenders. It's been taking 2 years, going to be his successor at GAO. But GAO is an organization which is very different from the Defense Logistics Agency. It's a small, elite organization of 3,000 people, mostly with graduate degrees. And they essentially did the same approach. They were beforehand, in 2001, before David's efforts, they were kind of an average government organization they didn't do much training. The training wasn't linked to anything strategic. They didn't know what to do about poor performers. They didn't, know how to recognize people. Their HR benefits and all of that stuff was very poor. People didn't have development plans. They didn't have teams. They didn't have lateral workforces. All of those things we talked about, they didn't have. And they put together a very, very robust sort of land, air, and sea approach. David, as those of you who have ever seen him know, he's a very charismatic leader. And he decided that the GAO would be a model for how a government agency could be in this way. And that the most important thing, that the way to get productivity up in this organization was by investing in these strategic assets of the workforce. He used a fairly similar approach to the one we've talked about a lot here, which involved a lot of training, a lot of attention to how they recruited and hired people and mentored them, a lot of recognizing employees. They had more flexibility because of the fact that they report to Congress, so they were able to introduce some more performance-based pay. And they shifted from, and they transformed, significantly in terms of their attrition rates, their retention rates, their entrepreneurial stuff, because of the kind of organization they were, was something where they were able to really change the way the organization felt. And I can't begin to tell you how different an organization is when it is one of these kind of organizations, because they are, when they begin to do this, they are night and day in the way that it feels to work there. The work at GAO was also transformative. This is a little harder to understand, but what this chart shows is that basically the financial benefits, by which we mean the number of improvements that the GAO detected that were actually implemented, went up during David's time there from 26 billion to 51 billion in the years that we studied. Now, you should probably discount, in the book we did discount this a little bit for the overall growth in government. It was not quite as dramatic as that, but still a very significant increase in their output, as well as the number of what I call non-financial benefits. And these are things where, for example, they show an organization how to do things more efficiently or with a better process, how to reduce the time it takes to process a patent or process a claim, or something like that, which is a good government thing. So they also had a great success in sort of following this approach. Let me show you now a third piece of the research in the book, turning to another piece of the research, and then we'll try and put it all together. One of the things we did, as I told you, the government is now trying to recruit hundreds of thousands of young people to work in all these different areas. And we surveyed college juniors and seniors nationwide. And the way we did the survey was that students were asked to evaluate, it was a two-part survey. First of all, a list of employer attributes, like, I want a, environment that's diverse and free from discrimination, for example. Opportunity to go as high in the organization as your abilities take you. And students were asked to evaluate these things on two criteria. One was, how important on a scale of 1 to 10 is this to you? And two is, does this thing apply more? Do you think you get more of this? And we did two separate surveys. One, did you get more in the private sector or in the public sector? And do you get more of it in the public sector or in the nonprofit sector? So we were able to look at these dimensions. Now, the first thing to say is that in the sample, it's 1,200 students, so this is a large, statistically robust sample. And here are all the attributes we tested. You can see things like competitive salary, strong pension plan, getting credit for accomplishments, flexible hours, vacation time, coworkers you respect and admire, challenging work, making a positive contribution to society, respecting balance between work and family, an organization that plays an active role, et cetera. A whole range of things which we got this group of attributes by doing focus groups with students beforehand. So the first thing to say is that overall, students around the country were not anti-government. So what I'm going to show you is even despite the backdrop that students said, 59% of college students said federal employees do important work, and 52% said that what happens in the federal government affects their daily life. So there was generally a pretty positive view of the federal government. And overall, about 40% of college students said that they would consider a job working for the federal government in some capacity. A higher percentage than that among students who had someone in their family who worked for the military or for the federal government, was as high as 50%. But when you look at the federal government compared with the private sector in terms of what was important to people and what applied to the government, there was this enormous gap. So the way to read this chart is that on the right-hand side, you have here what is more important. So you see that what students say was most important to them were things like working for an organization that cares about its employees, working for an organization that provides a good work-family balance, working for an organization that gives you the opportunity to go as high as your talents take you, working for an organization with good coworkers, diverse environment, all the things over to the right here. And if the students said that these things applied more to the federal government, it's up on the top, and if they said they applied more to the private sector, it's more on the bottom. And where you can see is that apart from secure organization, everything that the students cared about and said was important, they felt they would get a lot more of it working for the private sector than working for the government. Even though students were not against working for the government, they didn't see the government as an employer that offered all of these things. This is the same set of analysis against the nonprofit sector, and you see the same pattern where the overwhelming majority of the things that the students want, and here you see more, ethical conduct, getting credit, diverse environment, and so forth. People attributed more that they could get those benefits in the nonprofit sector than in the federal government. So we also found that there were a lot of structural impediments that prevented students from being able to work for the federal government even if they could overcome some of these issues. For example, more than 80% of the sample said that they couldn't afford to wait for more than 2 months after graduating to take a job. The word afford being a critical issue. But in the federal government, the average time to make a job offer, the average time is 82 days. And in most cases, that begins what is then a 6-month wait for security clearance. So what we found was that despite all this need to bring people in, that the federal government is not currently configured to be able to do this, either structurally or in terms of perception of young people. This is a lot of material, and this is, however, just a very small snapshot of all of the research and data which is in the book, some of the implications of this finding. First of all, we concluded that it's time for the country, at a time when people are kind of saying, well, the federal government is failing, so let's cut the federal government, that actually we really should be doing the opposite. We really should be investing in the federal government. I mean, we proposed in our book reducing the size of the federal government by about 2% and using that money to really train people who work for the government in all, not only specific skills, but the skills of network management and so forth. And specifically, we supported the idea of having a kind of civil service GI Bill that would enable people to, across the country, go to colleges, community colleges, and so forth, and train in the public service. Now, this idea was a little bit picked up, and I testified on this several times, by the Obama administration in its loan forgiveness program, which you've seen as part of the student loan reform, that if you go into public service, your loans are forgiven a little bit quicker. But really, the basic idea has not been embraced by the administration. I mean, if you look at the government, what we've done this week, the government this week has gotten into the student loan business and gotten rid of the banks. So that sounds like a good idea, but who is then going to actually do the work? Who is going to train the people to do a good job at administering loans for the millions of students in America? Who's going to make sure that the loan, that we don't end up with people waiting for a year like veterans do for their benefits, or for 3 years like inventors do for patents, you know, in the queues for student loans. There's sort of been no thinking about how do we, you know, create this really elite, well-trained, well-configured, well-honed, productive, efficient mechanism for doing student loans. It's just, well, you know, banks are out and government's in. And that thinking has not permeated into government. A second thing that we talked about, and I didn't really talk to you about today about all of our research into contractors and the relationship between the public and private sector doing work. But right now, the way the government is set up, you're either in it or you're out it. You know, there's no intermediate zone. And most young people that I know, my students, see their careers as being much wider than that, where they want to work in, you know, they want to work in the environmental field, and they want to work across a lot of sectors. You know, they're interested in doing a good job, making contribution to the environment, wherever sector that puts them. Right now, the government is not set up that way, so we have recommended going to a system that we call Core Ring, which would create an additional type of government, a sort of hybrid government employee. To give you like a very concrete example, supposing that the national park needs half an architect. They can't have half an architect. They can either have an architect or they can't have an architect. Let's say they wanted to share an architect with the Nature Conservancy, you know, who would pick up half of the salary. That makes a lot of sense, but the government is not set up that way. If you had a core ring, you could have these sort of hybrid employees paid and compensated by a variety of organizations. We've also talked about, you know, a variety of changes to the hiring system, the recruiting system, the compensation system, expanding the number of internships, the presidential management fellowships, which, as you may know, students in the audience, takes only 500 students a year. It's a great program, which could easily absorb 5 times that many. And the only reason that it has 500 is because it has 500. I mean, there's no, you know, reason for that. The other thing that we looked at and spent a lot of time trying to quantify was if the government were to really perform better, were to do some of these investments, were to be able to function more like a high-performing organization in the way that the Defense Logistics Agency and the GAO have been able to raise their performance, what would be the financial benefit, the savings, which is much quantified in our book, you know, to the government. And we found actually significant savings. So we found that over 10 years, it was between $300 to $500 billion in savings from greater efficiencies, which is something which is current, obviously very badly needed in our current economic environment. So with that, I think I will open it up to questions, and happy to take questions from anyone here in that research. Go ahead and.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
But I'd just like to remind you that if you have questions, please come up to the microphones that we have positioned in 2 places here. Thank you very much.
What does GAO stand for?
GAO stands for Government Accountability Office. It used to be Government Accounting Office. It's the Government Accountability Office. It is the office that is responsible for ensuring that money is spent where it's supposed to be spent, and that the government financial statements are secure, and that organizations are functioning, you know, efficiently. And it's also the sort of lead government watchdog organization.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
You've told us that the military and the private sector understand some things about how to deal with their workforces, and the government has not understood those things. Is it just that these things haven't occurred to the government before, or has there been some kind of resistance or opposition to doing things better?
That's a great question. I think the question of why strategies that are known and recognized has not permeated the federal government, even though it has performance problems, is a question that has many answers. One issue is that the government, because it in most cases has no competition, it has no organic reason to change. So if you are manufacturing a breakfast cereal and you see someone else is getting market share, you might very quickly think we need to change something, to change our cost structure, or our positioning, or our marketing, or our sales, or our distribution, or something, because we see something happening. The government doesn't, in most things it doesn't have competition. And you can see that where it does, for example, in the post office, it tries new things, but typically it doesn't try new things. So that's one answer. A second answer is that government unions are very active and very powerful and have generally blocked changes. And certainly many administrations have tried to get their arms around this problem. Paul Volcker, the former Fed chairman, who is a very thoughtful man, has run 2 government commissions on this topic and has reached many of the same conclusions we did. And despite that, and he's run bipartisan commissions, they've not been able to get over union opposition to enacting some of these changes. Some of the changes that were enacted during the Bush administration to try and get at some of these problems were blocked in lawsuits by the union. So there's been some active opposition. But I think a lot of the issue has been that it's been hard to, for some reason, and I don't really know why, people in government have looked everywhere else but to the people, kind of as a source of improvement. So we have looked at a very wide range of ways of fixing problems, which typically the typical governmental solution is to add more programs, more people to fix problems, rather than looking at sort of inward at really training and investing in the people that we start with. Yes.
Hi, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Like the snow?
Yeah, I like the snow. Thank you for coming out in the snow.
Definitely. I have a question about something I think is a large factor that you left out that's going to play a huge role, and that's the involvement of AmeriCorps and the compulsory voluntary service that they're going to be implementing in the near future, I guess. How is that going to play a role with making government more effective, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the general willingness or capacity of young people to go into public service is it's a terrific thing, and I think having vehicles like AmeriCorps and Teach for America and City Year and many of these programs are wonderful programs. The problem has been that there has not been a mechanism to connect people who do major voluntary efforts into government jobs that can then develop and train them and lead into satisfying careers. There has been a disconnect. So right now, if you come out of AmeriCorps, if you come out of Teach for America, whatever, and you put your resume into the USA Jobs website, you will not hear anything for 5 months, and then you'll get a snail mail postcard that says, we got your online application. That's the system now. So, I guess, in terms of the effectiveness of America overall, in terms of the country, I don't know. In terms of the effectiveness of that to fix this problem, I don't see any evidence that it's going to, unless these broken systems are fixed, I don't see any evidence it's going to help. But maybe I'm not, am I answering your question?
But yet that is the future, though. That's where we're heading towards, that type of system, setting that up. I mean, at least that's been the talk of this administration now. To get that pool of talent into the federal government at an earlier age, like having, you know, a required service that they have to do, and then selecting from that pool more people that could work directly into the government.
And what I'm saying is that, you know, if that could happen, that would work well.
Yeah.
But if we don't fix the systems for being in the government, I mean, for example, in the State Department, there are people queuing up to get into the State Department, okay, taking the Foreign Service exam, maybe some of you have. But people leave in droves after 4 years. There's absolute hemorrhage of people after the 4-year mark. So different agencies have different problems. You know, there the problem is retention, mentoring, you know, dual careers, which have not been focused on. So without really seriously looking at the human capital issues agency by agency, it doesn't matter how many AmeriCorps people you have. You know, it's not going to improve the performance of the government.
Agreed. Thank you.
Yes.
My question was, you'd outlined a number of obstacles to this change taking place in federal government, but also gave specific examples of where it had taken place and how well it had worked. So I guess my question for you was, in those specific instances where these changes had taken place, what was the difference and how were those changes made when some of these other ideas had not come through?
I would have to say that the impetus in both of the cases that I showed tonight was real leadership. You know, I mean, by David Walker at the GAO and Admiral Lippert at the Defense Logistics Agency, you know, and the tenacity to stay the course over a period of years and work these issues through, and a very, very strong belief that you know, essentially in individualism, that individual people and turning people into well-trained, individually high performers was the way to improve government performance overall, rather than just adding more. And unfortunately, both due to the lack of leadership that we have and to the fact that most government organizations have leaders who only stay there for, you know, 12 or 18 months, you know, we've not had too many. Now, we've had some leaders like Charlie Rosati at the IRS who did transform their organizations, but in a different direction. They were trying to fix customer service, you know, for example, at the IRS, he was trying to fix a customer service problem as opposed to a performance efficiency problem, with the result that at the IRS now, after sustained focus on that, I mean, when you call the IRS, they no longer treat you like a criminal because you're phoning, which is good, but their ability to collect on fraud and so forth is no better than it ever was, and we're in fact doing worse. So, you know, so it really takes a sort of sustained leadership focusing on this kind of strategy.
And so, based on your research and your perspective, what would be the next best steps to communicating to our leaders the importance of this, or how can we make this happen?
Well, I mean, I think that's a great question. You know, I would love to see the president, this president or any president, really take this on, you know, really, really take on this issue and to stand up and say this is important. The government is not working. This is what we have to do. This is a key component of what we have to do, and to try and you know, change and challenge the kind of status quo around the, you know, the idea of a sort of mediocre, you know, quasi-performing federal workforce.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Bilmes. We appreciate your talk very much. Oh, is there one more question? Where? Oh, here we go. All right.
This is actually a follow-up, I think, on a couple of the questions you've been asked. I have no experience working with the federal government, but I've been with state and county for 20 years. And much of what I see is because of the pay scale system and the promotion system, we move people up sort of to the level of their incompetence, and the kind of leadership that you're talking about doesn't happen because we don't bring in new people who might have some vision. Much of it is related to unions. I mean, there are a lot of factors involved. But how do we kick the government into looking around for people from the private sector who have this kind of data, different hiring models for upper division people?
Well, that's a great question. We did look at it quite a lot in the book. Most senior level jobs at all levels, state, municipal, county, federal government, are not open to people from outside the government. And there's almost no way to even find out that they exist. There's also within government at most levels a very demotivating problem around poor performers. And when we surveyed government workers and private sector workers, one of the biggest differences was in how they reported their supervisors were able to deal with poor performers. So in the private sector, about 80% said that if there was a poor performer, they had reasonable confidence in that the organization would solve the problem. In the government, I think it was 18%. I mean, it was less than 1 in 5. So you had a tiny fraction. And the way the question was worded, that was like 18% had any confidence that their supervisor could deal with a poor performer problem, which is, of course, a very demotivating situation. So, I believe that a much larger portion of jobs should be opened up outside of government. I believe that one of the ways to do that is by expanding the number of people who can come in as through the core ring model and through a much wider use of internships, so people can be tried out, which is more the model that they're used in other organizations. I think that we're beginning to see that, but we're just at the beginning. But it certainly has been a real blockage at sort of getting different kinds of talent in. And in the federal government, you see in many, many cases excellent candidates who apply from state government for federal jobs, and they are not even allowed to compete.
I think we have time for one more question.
I'm sure some of the things you've discussed would have been discussed at, say, the Harvard Business School in an introductory business course. I wondered to what extent at the Kennedy School you teach some of these issues, and whether any other academic programs in government teach this stuff.
My main subject, I teach public finance and budgeting. But I think that when you think about how well the government works, there's sort of people, money, and things. Things being systems, being real estate assets, being intellectual property, other things. And my sense is that we look a lot at the financial leverage points in the economy, but we don't look much at the people side, which is why we decided to try and look at this. And at the Kennedy School, we are certainly looking at, there are a number of people who are looking at this issue, who from different perspectives, and trying to understand why is it so difficult for Kennedy School students to get a job in the government. We have so many fantastic students who I could tell you stories that would stand your hair on end, about absolutely fantastic students who cannot get into the government. And we've tried to look, what are the impediments? Why can't the government hire good people? Why does it take the government 6 months to hire somebody? Why does the USA job site dysfunctional? All these kind of things. There's been less work really on thinking about beyond that. How do you really change the culture of the organization from within and create a more motivating kind of environment? The place where this work has happened most, in addition to our work, has been actually within the military, because the military has many portions of itself where it has both a military and a civilian wing. You know, there are 700,000 civilian military employees. And for example, I was telling someone at lunch today, the Army Nursing Corps, who is run by a very impressive female general, who's the deputy surgeon general and, you know, nurse. So she has 80,000 Army nurses. 40,000 of them are military Army nurses and 40,000 are civilian Army nurses. They do the same work. I mean, so if you go to Walter Reed Army Hospital, you know, the nurse on the day shift and the night shift will be handing off to each other, one Army, one civilian. But she has almost unlimited budget for training her military nurses and no budget at all for training her civilian nurses, when everyone knows that a nurse with more training is a better thing to have. I mean, you know, it's not controversial. And so, I mean, for example, you know, I am working with the Army Nursing Corps in tracking how many accidents they have that could be prevented if they had been able to train the civilian nurses to the extent of the military nurses doing the same jobs. So there are a number of areas in the military where this kind of work is going on, but, you know, but generally it has not been an area where there's a huge amount of research. So I say Jeffrey Pfeffer at Stanford Business School, probably the leading academic, and he is at a business school.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Bilmes.